chapter 17 and verse. Got it. Jeremiah 17 and verse 5. This is what the Lord says. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lives. Stop right there for a moment. So you ever felt that way before? You ever felt, I'm just kind of wasting away here. My life is not what I thought it was going to be. I feel kind of parched. Everything around me just feels kind of dry, kind of dull. I don't feel much life in me like I think I'm supposed to. I know that I felt that way in my past. I'm sure we all have at one time or another. We may be feeling that way this morning. And Jeremiah addresses that, and he says it's, and I know at least it was from me, because my heart had turned away from the Lord. And that is how I felt why I felt that way. Verse 6b, but blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. And although we may be living in a parched land and a wasteland and a desert, this is where we want to be, isn't it? We want to be, like a tree planted by the water. And we all know what that looks like, a tree that is healthy, that is flourishing, that, the leaves are green, that, maybe the fruit is out on the tree at that point. And that's what we think, oh, that's the way life's supposed to be, where you're living just a bountiful life. You're not afraid. You have no worries. You don't worry when times get bad. It always seems like my life is going, the way I always wanted it to be. And sometimes we try to figure out, well, how do I get from the wasteland to the tree planted by the stream? How do I get there? And in verse 9 and 10, which is what we're going to talk about this morning, Jeremiah tells us how not to get there. How not to get there. And what we're going to talk about today is how not to get to that place. And next week, we're going to talk about how to get to that place. So you have to come back next week for this lesson to mean anything. So be sure and do that. So in verse 9, Jeremiah says this, and this is maybe a verse that we've read before. For some of us, it's probably a verse that somebody read to us at one time in our lives. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can possibly understand it? You see, I think when we want to move from the wastelands to the bountiful tree, or from a life that doesn't seem to have much going on in it, empty, to a life that's full, the first place we want to look at is our heart. We'll have people. Have you ever heard anybody tell you before? Well, you just got to trust your heart. If you'll just look to your heart will tell you the direction you must go. And truth be told, that is absolutely the worst advice you could ever give or ever follow, is to just follow your heart. That is terrible advice. He says here that the heart is deceitful. Deceitful means it is fraudulent, it is crooked, or something that is polluted. And that if we want to know which way to go, you don't want to turn to something that is fraudulent, polluted, crooked, or that just lies. Have you ever known anybody that after you got to know them for a while, you thought, they just lie all the time? We've all met people like that. That lying was as natural to them as maybe it is to us, as to telling the truth. so much that they don't even know when they're lying because it's become so much a part of who they are. I had a boss one time, and she was telling me about her life, and she was telling me about her ex-husband, and why they got divorced. And Chris said, the reason we got divorced is because he was such a liar. And I said, well, Chris, how did you know he was a liar? She said, his lips were moving. She said, that's how I knew. When his lips were moving, he was lying. And, Megan Trainor wrote a whole song about that. His lips are moving, he's a liar. And we know people like that, but guess what? Our hearts are that way. Our hearts are liars. It is deceitful. And the heart, what you feel, what goes on in your heart, oh, this is the way I ought to go because I feel so strong about this, is usually incorrect. Look over in Proverbs. Hold your place here in Jeremiah because you can go back there. But look over in Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 26. Proverbs 28 and verse 26. He says, those who trust in themselves are fools, but those who walk in wisdom are kept safe. Now, the New Living Translation has a really great phraseology, that first verse. It says, those who trust in their own wits are fools. Those who trust in their own wits. Sometimes people will be complimented and say, oh, well, they live by their wits, or they got lots of street smarts, they just live by their wits. He says people who live by their wits are fools, because you can't trust your wits. You can't trust your heart. Going back to Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 9, I want to say one other thing before we move on to the second part here. He says the heart is deceitful above all things. Above all things. There is nothing more deceitful than the heart. Nothing that exists anywhere is more deceitful than your heart. And that's why you can't trust it for your decisions, for about how to get from an arid place to a fruitful place. That's not where you want to go. He said the heart is deceitful above all things. And then he says it is beyond cure. It is beyond cure. A lot of versions say it is desperately sick. It is desperately sick. The heart is deceitful above all things, and it is desperately sick. It's kind of like the difference between having a heart murmur, a minor heart murmur, and having congestive heart failure. If we can think about it, that's what it's like. Most of us think, oh, I just have, a little heart murmur going on here spiritually. But in reality, we are suffering from congestive heart failure or congenital heart disease, if we want to think about it like that. He says it is beyond cure. There's no one, there is no physician in the world who can cure your spiritual heart disease. I was listening to a guy talk about this the other day, and he gave a really good description, which I want to share with you. In 1835, I think it was, there was a trail that was opened up between Independence, Missouri and Oregon. It was called the Oregon Trail. We probably remember reading about that in history class when we were little kids, about the Oregon Trail. And it ran from Missouri to Kansas to Nebraska to Wyoming to Idaho to Oregon, and even went beyond into the state of Washington. It was still called the Oregon Trail. I forgot how many thousands of miles it was, but during the time that it was open, from the 1830s till end of about 1870, when people started going across America by trains, 500,000 Americans traveled the Oregon Trail, and they traveled in covered wagons. And those covered wagons would go and they would leave ruts in the road. And so that's how they knew what the road was. It wasn't paved. They would follow the ruts. Well, you can go to, I think it's 5 separate national parks in America right now, and you can see the ruts of the Oregon Trail. They're still there. Still there. 190 years later, you're still there. And you say, what's got to do with the heart? That's kind of the way our heart is when it's desperately sick, when it's beyond cure. It is a rut that's super, super hard to get out of. And because our heart's telling us, well, there's nothing wrong anyway, when someone tells us, well, you know, you need to change your heart, or this needs to change, we say, well, I can't do it. And we're stuck in a rut. It takes a lot to get out of a rut. If you've ever been in a road, we had lots of ruts in it, and you haven't been, just drive out to Trisha's house one day, and you'll get that full experience of being in a road with lots of ruts in it, although it is better. You can drive out there. The first time we went out there, I thought my car was going to sink into a water hole that's 10 feet deep, you know, because it was just ruts and it was hard to get out of it. And he says, that's what the heart is like. It is beyond cure. It is desperately sick. Micah, you can look at this later on. It's Micah chapter 1 and verse 9. Micah chapter 1 and verse 9. Micah's talking about the sins of Samaria. And he says, my people's wounds are too deep to heal. He said, my people's wounds are too deep to heal. And that is what goes on in our heart when it gets so consumed, such in a rut with the sin in our lives. It is just desperately sick, and it is almost too deep to heal. And we hear people express that when we talk about life change and heart change. Say, well, I don't know if I can do it. I've just been doing this so long, I don't know that I can change. That is, the heart is deceitful and it's beyond cure. And then he says in verse 9, just stick with me. We're going to get to good news in just a moment. I don't want you to turn it off, because this is so discouraging. And then the final thing he says here, he says, and who can understand it? Who can possibly understand the heart? The heart is simply beyond understanding. We do things, we feel things, we say things, and you know, we don't even know sometimes why we did things or why we say things, because we did it from our heart, and the heart is just beyond understanding. It's almost beyond understanding physically, as many heart doctors will tell you, but spiritually it is definitely beyond understanding. And that's why your advice that comes from your heart is not good advice. The advice that comes from your heart is not good advice. When I was a little kid, Walt Disney had a animated show, movie, Pinocchio. I don't know if anybody saw Pinocchio when they were a little kid. Jimmy Cricket, and you know, and one of the great songs from Pinocchio was "Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide." You know, Pinocchio, I know you got a wooden heart, but just let your conscience be your guide. What terrible advice, because people have our consciences are awful sometimes. You can't let your conscience be your guide. You can't let your feelings be your guide. On a more serious note, Ernest Hemingway, who was one of the great novelists in American history, some think maybe one of the greatest novelists in American history. This was Ernest Hemingway's philosophy of life. He said, what is moral, or what is right, is what you feel good after, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after. Let me read that again. Think about what that means. What is moral is what you feel good after. What is immoral is what you feel bad after. So if you do something, no matter what it is, but after you get through doing it, you feel good, then you didn't do anything wrong. On the other hand, you do something, no matter what it is, you feel bad the next morning, then that was probably the wrong thing to do. And so for him, that justified this total life of immorality that he lived. Just a complete life of immorality. Because when people quote, he says, well, I don't feel bad about it, so it must have been a good thing to do. It made me feel good. Who can understand the heart? The heart gives terrible advice. So, got this bad heart. How do we get the kind of heart that we need to move from the wasteland to the bountiful land? And that's in verse 10. He said, I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind, to reward each person according to their conduct, according to what their deeds deserve. So, who knows our heart the best? Well, the Lord knows your heart the best. That's who you go to to find out about what your heart is like and to find out about how to get your heart to change and to move from the wastelands to the bountiful land, because the Lord knows your heart. So the other day we went to the doctor. I had one of my checkups. I had my yearly checkup. And so I went in, and the first thing the guy does after he asked me a few questions, he said, well, I get up there on the little, sit up there a little bit. He says, I want to check your heart and your lungs. Breathe deep, breathe deep, and he goes all around breathing deep. And he says, your heart and your lungs sound fine. That's what I wanted to hear. And I wanted to hear it from him. Now, Christy may get a stethoscope and say, oh, your heart sounds fine. I love Christy, but she's not a licensed medical professional. Now, sometimes she thinks she is, but she's really not. And although her opinion matters to me, I want to hear from Dr. Thielen that my heart is good. And that's why we don't need to listen to other people or to ourselves about how our heart is. We need to listen to what God says. And that's because God is the creator. God made our hearts, right? When he created us in our mother's womb, he's the one that made our hearts. And he is a perfect heart specialist to diagnose our hearts. And what God says about our hearts, that's what matters. That's what counts, not how we feel. So I want to look at 3 verses real fast. The first one is found in 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and 29. 1 Chronicles chapter 28. And I want us to read verses 8 and 9. 1 Chronicles 28, 8 and 9. So David is planning to build the temple, and God has come to him and said, I'm not going to let you do it because of the blood on your hands. I'm going to let your son Solomon build the temple. And so David is giving this charge to his son about the temple that he will build in the future. And so he says in verse 8, so now I charge you, Solomon, my son, in the sight of all Israel and of the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, be careful to follow all the commands of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and pass it on as an inheritance to your descendants forever. And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every desire and every thought. You see that? The Lord searches every heart. The Lord understands. The heart doesn't understand, but the Lord understands every desire and every thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. It's David wants Solomon to understand here something, because David understood it. David lived by this principle that the Lord knows your heart. He understands you the best. Don't listen to your heart, Solomon. Listen to the Lord. Now, for a while, Solomon listened to the Lord. But after a while, Solomon started listening to his heart. And he says that in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a whole book there about how Solomon listened to his heart. And his life, except to the very end, was a disaster. Because he didn't trust what the Lord said about his heart, but he tried to understand himself what was going on in his heart. And he totally messed the whole thing up. Psalms chapter 7. Psalms chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. Psalm 7, 8 and 9. This again is from David. Starting in verse 8 of Psalm 7. Let the Lord judge the peoples. Vindicate me, Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. Bring to an end the violence of the wicked, and make the righteous secure. You, the righteous God, who probes minds and hearts. So how's he going to be vindicated? How are the righteous going to be made secure? How the violence of the wicked are going to end? He said it's going to come from a righteous God who probes the minds and the hearts. God is a physician who is willing to do open heart surgery if we are willing to have open heart surgery done. He just is willing to do that. And he's not some, guy's the first time he's ever done it. He's always done it. And if we're willing to let God get in there and probe our mind and our hearts and not listen to our hearts, but God, will be secure and we can overcome the violence from the wicked. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 23. As you see, this is a theme that runs throughout all of Scripture. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 23. Paul and John, rather, writing to the church at Thyatira, quoting the Lord and speaking about Jezebel, who was a prophet there, at least a woman who had that name. He says, I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. So they were having trouble with this woman who was claimed to be a prophetess, and she was leading the children of God astray in the church of Thyatira. And God said, I will take care of her because I know what's going on in her heart and her mind. She may not even known it. The church in Thyatira may not have understood her motives, but God said, I know her motives because I know her heart and I know her mind. And God knows our heart and our mind, no matter how the image, no matter what image we try to present to other people, and we can fool a lot of the people a lot of the time, right? We can do that. God knows our hearts, and he will judge our hearts and our thoughts because he understands the heart. So when I was in ninth grade, I got called down to the principal's office. It wasn't usually why I got called down to the principal's office. This was different. So I wasn't very upset about going down to the principal's office. I got called down, and the minister for our church was sitting there in the principal's office. And I wasn't very smart, but I figured out this is not good. And so the minister, Garland Elkins, he pulled me aside. He said, hey, he said, I got to take you to the hospital. He said, your dad's had a serious heart attack. And the truth is, Gary, we don't think he's going to live. And so this happened very early in the morning. I just got to school. He got me his car, ran up to the hospital. My mom came out there in the outside the intensive care unit, just weeping. We don't think your dad's going to live. My brother was there. I mean, it was just terrible. But he had a great physician, and this guy pulled him through, rescued him. And it was almost miraculous that he lived back then, having a heart attack in 1966, because usually guys didn't survive that. So after he'd gotten better and was doing well, he went back to this physician for his first appointment. And he said, here's Mr. Roberson, here's what you need to do. And he gave him this list of things to do. And the reason my dad had a heart attack, partially is because he had smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day from the time he was 13 years old. Winston cigarettes, by the way. And so my dad, says, I want to know one thing, doctor. He says, can I continue to smoke? And the physician goes, yes, of course you can. He said, you smoke as much as you've always smoked, if that's what you want to do. He said, of course, you're going to die real fast. He said, but you can just go ahead and keep smoking those cigarettes all you want. And my dad took the pack out, wadded it up, threw it away, and never smoked again. Now, he did that because he was scared, but he also did it because he had someone who was a physician who knew about hearts and told him the truth. And I think that's what we want to be like. That when God tells us the truth about our hearts, we need to listen to that. We need to go, you know what? God knows my heart. God understands my heart. I don't even understand my heart, but if God tells me in my heart, this is what needs to change, and this is what I need to do in order to move from the dry land to the bountiful land, that's what I'm going to do and trust him as my physician. So I read this yesterday. I'm going to share this and we'll wrap it up. There was a study done at Ohio State University Wexner Medical School. It was done in 2022. It was a survey of 2,000 Americans who came through their heart procedural place there and had heart examinations and so forth. And this is what they discovered about those 2,000 Americans. Half of those under the age of 45 believed that they were not at risk for heart disease. And yet the national statistics prove that a lot of people under the age of 45 are prone to heart disease. And yet most of those believe that they were not, it could never happen to them. The survey also found that 32% of all Americans are not confident that they would know even if they were having a heart attack. So 1 out of 3 Americans, if they were having a heart attack, they go, is that what that was? I had no idea what that was. They just would not know. Why? Because when it comes to our hearts, we're pretty ignorant about our physical hearts, and we're pretty ignorant about our spiritual hearts. Let's don't let our hearts deceive us. Let's don't let our hearts convince us that nothing is wrong. The heart doesn't understand, but God understands. And if we're willing, God will heal our hearts, and God will enlighten us about our hearts. And what we want is an enlightened heart and not a deceitful heart. So God bless you guys. Thanks for everyone listening this morning. Great to see you all today.